that, I'm going to pull up our agenda today, and we have a number of things going on today. We're first going to have a presentation by Aaron and on the Department of Energy's low-income energy affordability data tool. And after half an hour, we will transition to looking at energy burden and affordability trends in Washington. This will be presented by Juliet. She is an intern here at the Department of Commerce. And then we will go on to have a broader discussion of the statewide data needs. And we'll close by looking at next steps. So I will move over to the PowerPoint now. Sarah, is there anything that I am missing or anything you want to say to kick us off?
Thanks, Austin. Hi, everyone. Hopefully, I'm catching everyone after a nice long weekend. I also just want to take a second and say that I hope our East Washington friends are doing okay. It's really scary out there right now. So I just hope that everyone's safe, and you know, we're seeing the smoke here on the west side. So you all are definitely central in my thoughts today. I do want to just say in general, the kind of the arc of the work that we've been doing is going to shift now. And so we're about, gosh, now it's been a couple of months or a month or so that we have the data tool open. So I've gotten a lot of questions. Thank you so much for participating on that. And I was away from my desk for a couple of weeks. I'm still working through some of the questions. So if you've sent me an email and I haven't responded, don't hesitate to just send it again. Some things have been kind of buried. So, but I've really appreciated those questions, and I've also appreciated the quick response from the tag when I had questions that couldn't be answered. So thank you all for that. So moving towards the end of the year, we're really going to start just kind of focusing on the rest of the data that we need to put together and understand what's going to be the most useful for everyone that needs to use it to do work that'll be due from utilities next year around these assessment reports. So, you know, this refers to section 3A in section 120, and this is all the data that Commerce is being directed to aggregate for the state. And so we had that really lovely presentation from Hassan from Empower Data Works. Gosh, it was a couple of months ago now, but you know, where he walked through a dashboard that Chelan PUD has contracted him for. And you know, that is, as I've mentioned multiple times, and we'll continue to mention, the high watermark in what we're doing. But you know, we also have this great work from DOE around the low-income energy affordability data tool. And this is going to be our big workhorse for a lot of the data for the state. So I'm really excited and honored to have Aaron from NREL here today to talk to us about that work and talk about that database. And then getting to jump through and listen to Juliet talk about how we've tried to apply it, kind of a first blush attempt that she's done in this great work over the summer. So I really encourage this to be a conversation. We want to think creatively about how we can use this data, and also wanting to know, you know, how utilities would find, you know, and other stakeholders as well, of course, you would want to see this data used. So lots of opportunity for our data analysis hats to be put on here and do some creative work. So with that, I am going to kick it over to Austin to kick it over to Aaron. I think it's the order of operations.
All right, Aaron, are you with us?
Yes, I am. Can everybody hear me?
We can.
Yes.
Wonderful. That's great. Hi, everyone. My name is Aaron Weimont. I am a developer here at the National Renewable Energy Lab in Colorado. So sorry to hear about the fires in Eastern Washington. We have had several of those here as well, one of which is the worst in state history. So great. But I hope everyone's doing okay. So I'm going to go through a little bit of the lead tool. And it sounds like some of you are familiar with it. So I'll talk a little bit about how it works, and then do a quick walkthrough of the tool just to show some of the features in case there are things people aren't familiar with. And then happy to answer any questions, or if we want to wait till the end, that's totally fine. I'll hang around to the end of the presentations today, and hope everyone finds something new from this. So, all right, I'm gonna share my screen and get going. I want to share this one. Okay, can everybody or somebody please let me know if they can or cannot see my screen?
We can see it.
Okay, well, that's great. So this is the Lead Tool website up on energy.gov. And this tool came about last year. Actually, it used to be part of what was called the Celica data set. And that was basically all of the data that you find here in the Lead Tool. But it was all in a spreadsheet format. So it was many Excel files and things like that. And you could download the data and then run it through some Excel templates and get some other information out of it. But we migrated that all to this web platform, so it's a lot more interactive, especially with some of the map functionality that I'll show you in a little bit. The data comes from the Census Bureau and the American Community Survey. We recently updated all the data from information from 2018. That's as new as we can get because the data needs to be aggregated over time to be more useful. So everything has been updated with some of the most recent data that we have. And we made a few other changes as well that I can talk about as I kind of go through it. So I will just do a quick run through of the tool, show some of the features, and then anyone can ask some questions. I did see there was one thing that popped up in the chat, but it might be hard for me to do both of those things. So I'll probably just wait and answer some questions towards the end.
And Aaron, we can have Austin, if it was me sending a link out to everyone for the tool,
great.
if they want to follow along at home. But it's also, you know, you can watch it as well. But Austin will be able to kind of break in if there's any questions we have as we go along. So don't worry about monitoring the chat.
Cool, sounds great. I brought it up here too, just in case I need to, because it disappeared when I started sharing my screen. Okay. So here we have the tool itself. Just one second, let me bring up my notes. That's always helpful. So just as a general overview, you can see we have our interactive map. We have an interactive chart. And then here on the left-hand side is a lot of the filtering options that we have and kind of various combining and comparison options that I will also get into in more detail. So kind of at first glance, you can see we have all the states and Puerto Rico included here in our map. Since you all are in Washington State, I'll go ahead and use this as our example. If you click on the state, you have options to look at a map of the counties in Washington, the census tracts, or the cities. I'll go ahead and just click on census tracts because that seems to be one of the more commonly used ones that you all have. It may take just a second for it to load, especially since I'm presenting. But then we have our wonderful map pop up. It has outlines of all of the counties in the state as it is. And then within those, you can see all of the census tracts. So here we have census tract 9603 in Lincoln County. And so just to break into a little more data about, or a little more information about the map, we have 3 different output options that you can use. So we have average energy burden as a percent of income, average annual energy costs, and then housing counts. So you can click on any of these and it'll update the map accordingly, and also adjust the scale and the legend that you're looking at. And same is true for housing counts. Yeah, so you can choose whichever output is most appropriate for whatever it is that you're looking at. I know in a lot of cases, and particularly with the work Sarah and I have been discussing, it's been a lot of average energy burden. We also then, you can zoom in as much as you kind of need to find the census tracts that you're looking for. So if you're looking for some here in King County, you can zoom in and click on those. And then you can also look at counties and cities as well, which has very similar behavior. One note on cities, I'll click on the map here and show, is we don't actually do the city boundaries, and we don't have every single city. It's just most of the kind of cities that we can collect data for. So this one does look a little different. And this is just because city boundaries change quite regularly. and the Census Bureau doesn't keep up with all of that. So while the bounds of the city may be different, we just can't collect data on that because it doesn't quite exist yet. So you can still see it just based on the general area of the cities. And then also, if you're looking for something in particular, we have a search option. So it'll default to whatever state and map that you're looking at. So in this case, we're looking at the cities in Washington State. But if you want to, you could look at kind of anything else. So here are the census tracts in Washington State, and I just happen to remember King County was one of the ones that we are looking at. So if I want to look at census tract 4.01 in King County, I can click on that. It'll take me then to that map, and with that entity selected. It's a little hard to see here because it's so tiny, so it doesn't actually show up here, but the census tract is selected. Okay, and then in a little bit later, I'll get into some of the comparisons here if we need, or sorry, just to get into a little more detail, but I don't want to get lost on other parts of the tool first. Then down below, we do have our chart showing some of the outputs broken down by whatever filter you're currently looking at. So in this case, we're looking at area median income, but we do also have options for viewing building age, heating fuel type, building type, and rent and own. So I can click on any of these and it will change the chart to see down here, we're looking at the building age before 1940, 59, 79, 99, etc. So there's quite a bit of functionality that can actually come with this. You can add a secondary dimension to it. So for example, I wanted to look at rent and own, it will break the data down further into the building age and then split those into renter and owner occupied homes. And this can be done kind of for any combination that you want to do. You can change the left axis if you want. So it defaults to average energy cost, but you could do energy burden. And then you can also add onto the right axis other information that you might want to have. In this case, here are housing counts. Both of these options allow you to download an image or the data that was used to create the map or the chart. So this, if you want to use it other places in presentations, or if you just want to view the data yourself, you can do that and play around with it and see what you want to do. Okay, so then the other pieces of the tool here, we have this left-hand navigation that I mentioned before. The top button here is just a little switch to a dark mode to assist, particularly people might be visually impaired and want high contrast. So this is our kind of high contrast dark mode. Nothing fancy about it, but that's one of the options. These links here, they just give you more information about the lead tool if you need to read anything about that. Some of this will be updated relatively soon, but most of it still is all very, very relevant. And then we also have some case studies as well. If you want to look at real people who've used the tool, we can, the National Grid one and the Kentucky one are the most recent, and those can be used just if you're looking for examples of how people have used the tool successfully. We have comparisons, which again, I'll get into in just a little bit more detail later. And then we, as I mentioned before, have all these different filters that we can use. So right now, by default, everything is selected when you first come to it, but you can switch your income model if you want to. State and median income is one of the ones that we recently added. And so you can look at the state median income for these areas. And if you want to focus on, let's say, people who are lower than a certain threshold, you can simply uncheck these boxes. Both the map and the chart then will update to, oh, I got a little cut off, to show what you have selected. So it looks a little funny here because it's just two giant chart options, but here's showing 0 to 30% and 30 to 60 state median income, which is what I have selected. And the same is true for any of these other filters. So you can select or deselect any of them, and the map, there's a bug there, good to know. And the map will update accordingly. So if I need to include buildings only of a certain age, then it only will pull in that data. Or if I get rid of those, then it will use different data. And we have, oopsies, my mouse. Oh boy, 1 second, please. Lost my mouse. There it is. Okay, and that's true for any of these other options as well. So we have our heating fuel type, which is just the primary heating fuel type, not secondary, and this doesn't. And there's these various different options that we can see here. And then we also have our building type, which is one that we recently changed. So now we do have groupings for boat, RV, van, and mobile trailer. So if you're looking to get some specific information about those, you can, but it also has these breakdowns of all the way from 1 unit up to 50+ unit buildings. And as we saw before, we do also have renter occupied and owner occupied. So then one of kind of the big features that people wanted with the tool was be able to combine things together and to compare items. And so if we look here, we have state median income broken down in these various categories, but you can kind of combine them into options that you might want. So if I click on combine criteria filters and click on state median income, I can simply drag and drop items here. So if I wanted to call this low income, I could do that. And this is just an example. Apologies if these groupings don't totally make sense, but in this one we could call high income. And then we can look at these kind of together as opposed to having to click separately and turn off each filter. So if I just want to look at low income, I simply deselect high income. And then these all show up correctly. And then that also is available to us if we do comparisons. So I think this is something that could be very helpful for a lot of people, and we've heard that from other stakeholders. But as an example, and I clicked on this earlier, you can select a census tract or a census tract. You can compare any 2 items. So you could compare a state to a census tract, a state to a county to a census tract. Any of those are possible. So any entity you can click on the map can be compared to each other. So in this case, I clicked on a census tract, and I can either compare this tract individually, I can compare it to all tracts within this county, or I can compare it to the county itself. In this case, I can just add the census tract here. It defaults to comparing to whatever map you're currently viewing. In this case, it's Washington State. So if I look down here, now I see I have both Washington and census tract 9602 on my chart, and it's showing the breakdown of those and kind of comparing the 2 items. Now, in the case of, you can see the housing counts here, Washington State obviously has a greater number of housing units than an individual census tract. But you can see that's just a way of showing that you can compare any 2 items together that you might want to. And similarly, let's just say if I select this one and I want to compare all tracts in here, now I can see that all of these census tracts were added. I can remove Washington State if I no longer need that. And then similarly, we can combine these together. So I don't totally know how all these census tracts would go together, but if I wanted a particular group, I could grab these 3 census tracts and just call them special tracts, and I could save that. And then those 3 get grouped together, and all the other ones are separate. So you can, and then the chart's going to get very messy because there's a lot of items, but you can then see that these special tracts are the 3 that are combined together. So it's actually doing a weighted average of all of the values in those 3 census tracts that we combined together. And then kind of the last feature here is actually, I'll just remove a few of these so it's a little bit cleaner, just because that's a lot. Sure, we'll just have 4 on there. And then one of the last main features that we have is the ability to save this, which doesn't make you have a user account or anything. So if I want to save this, I can click on this save scenario button. It creates a custom URL. So if I take this and I'll just do it in a new tab and load the tool here, it should load everything and keep all of the options that we had previously selected here. So as you can see, my groupings are all still here. The items that are selected are also selected on the map. The chart looks the same, and the filters and all of this custom grouping here is still the same. So I know that's a lot, and I apologize for going quickly. I do want to save, just didn't want to take up too much time and save room for questions or anything, but that's kind of the overview of the tool. Happy to see if anyone has anything else that they've struggled with or have questions about. And if not, I'm happy to wait until a little later too. So Austin, I'll kick it back to you.
Thanks, Aaron. That's a great presentation. We don't have any questions in the chat box right now. Does anyone want to unmute and ask a question? Or maybe Sarah wants to provide some summary comments that kind of tee us up for questions.
Oh, well, I actually had a question. Aaron, can you scroll down to the chart that you had brought up? So I notice the dots are housing counts, right?
Yes, in this case.
So I notice on that first green bar that it looks like the housing count is 0.
Yes.
And so I'm kind of curious, what does that mean about the data? Juliet will mention a little bit about some of the limitations, but if you could just speak a little bit about where this data comes from, right? You said ACS. So how do I have 0, but then I still have a energy burden there? So a little confusing.
That's totally fair. Part of it's just because of the scale of the chart, which can be a little difficult and something to keep in mind if you're comparing two items. That might, in the case that I showed before, even of Washington State compared to a census tract, the number of housing counts are going to be a lot different. If you hover over it, there's a little tooltip here that actually shows the housing counts as being 3. And so that's definitely something to keep in mind. If there's 0, this bar in theory will not show up at all. So that should be the case. Or won't have anything to show potentially. But that is a possibility. So this, as we mentioned, the data does come from the Census Bureau, but there will be limitations in terms of the number of responses that they got back. So if somebody had gone out to a census tract and only found or only got responses from a couple of let's just look at an example here of let's say building types, right? They only were able to get a couple of 1-unit detached responses, then that's going to limit some of the data there. So yeah, that's a good point, Sarah. It does look like 0. If you hover over it, it shows 3. So you can definitely double check what that is. And then also if you download the data, it'll show all the numbers that were used to make the chart. But that is definitely something to keep in mind. And if it was, there will be warnings flagged on the site actually if the numbers are really, really low or we're not totally sure on them. But so it might see like a red outline around one of these rectangles if there's an issue. Where we feel like it's worth the user knowing that very little data was used to create this. But you're probably going to see that more if you're looking at very specific filters. So if you, for example, were looking at only looking at 1-unit detached, only looking at utility gas, and only looking at buildings before 1940, there might be very few that actually meet that requirement. And so the data may not have quite as many housing counts as you might expect, and it might throw a little warning saying, hey, this is a very small amount of data. So that is, that's kind of where that comes from, but it's a really good point to bring up, just to be aware of. And then, like you said, Juliet, we'll go into some of this later too, some of the limitations.
Yeah, and I just appreciate bringing that up because I have heard from stakeholders with concerns, especially in more rural areas, about response rates or, sampled data for the census. So just a good note that one, you can hover over the actual numbers, you can download the data into Excel, and then also that you'll get this warning if it's low kind of sampled data. So that's all really good information. Thank you. Yep. I also just want to point out for folks here too, the breakdown of the fuel types. So I know that we've gotten a lot of questions about how we have a lot of utilities in our state that are electricity only, and actually some regions that are electricity only, right? So if we're thinking about burden and you're a single fuel, utility, how are we going to think about kind of your piece of the burden? And so I do appreciate this current look. And Erin, I don't know if you have any more to say about the breakdown of fuel types, or if you want to speak to that at all.
Certainly. So there's two things I would mention about that. Yeah, it's good to. I'm glad you mentioned that, Sarah. This is great contextual information that I did not know about Washington State. But if you do happen to have electricity only for a heating fuel type, then yeah, you'll see in the case of hovering over this, electricity is 5%, and then we also have it broken down by gas and other. But in your case, it looks like I picked a random county that must be electricity only, or at least these areas, because gas and other are representing 0% of it. You could also switch this to annual energy cost. And then looks like we have electricity at, yeah, the other ones must just be small enough. Gas is $8, other is $78, but electricity is about $1,200. So you can also see the breakdown of the costs with that too. And so when we are, that's also what, gets included in all of these as well. So if you're looking at average annual energy costs, and if you hover over this, you can just see what some of these numbers are. That's actually combined gas, electricity, and other into the map, because the map can only show one level at a time. So those are done through a weighted average and pulled in. So that's where some of this data is broken down as well. But in your case, if you have electricity as the main energy source, that might be the only value that you see.
Awesome, thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I do want to leave the floor open for anyone that just has some questions, or something that pops to mind that you want to know more about, or do a little quick deeper dive right now. All right, well, no worries. It's a lot to kind of take in, and I will say there is just an incredible wealth of information on this site. So I look forward to folks kind of taking a look at this and thinking about how they might use it, and then helping us think about how we might use it as a state. So Erin, thank you so much for the presentation. I think at this point we'll switch over to Juliet, who is going to show kind of a first foray into how we're trying to think about analyzing some of this data for Washington State. So I will stop talking and let Juliet introduce herself, and we will hop into her presentation.
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name's Juliet Randazza, and I'm one of the interns working at Commerce this summer. And I'm going to talk about trying to apply some of this Washington lead tool data. Next slide. So we're really excited to present this data just because it cuts across a lot of the activities and programs that Commerce performs. And yeah, next slide. First, I'm going to talk about accessing this lead tool data, which I guess is a reiteration of what Erin just went over. Next slide. So I downloaded this data from the lead tool, which you just saw, and I was able to create a customized data profile for Washington State. And I used county level data for area median income, building type, owned versus rented households, fuel types, average annual energy expenditures, and average annual energy burden, as well as housing counts. So this data can also be downloaded at the city and census tract level, but just for ease of handling the data, I chose county level. And just to reiterate, this data was very recently updated, and is from 2018. And you can also access a lot of raw data on the DOE website. Next slide. So some of the limitations with this data includes that the data was sampled and is in aggregate rather than taken from the household level. Electricity and gas expenditures are also from 1 month and then extrapolated for the entire year. And this month of expenditures isn't publicly reported, so it can be a little bit difficult for utilities to compare their numbers. The data includes only occupied housing units, even though unoccupied housing units might contribute to energy costs. There's also a potential sampling bias from non-response. And characteristics for census tracts might be different from the microdata samples that were used to build the larger data set. We also found that when we were calculating, for some of our calculations, the high energy burden threshold that we use does not always show actual affordability. And this threshold is the 6%, which is included in the guidance for CETA. It works under the assumption that energy costs should be no greater than 20% of shelter costs, and that shelter costs should not be greater than 30% of household income. And this works out to about 6% of household income spent on energy, where anything higher is considered high energy burden. So this is a threshold used by a lot of federal programs, and some things to remember is that it's judgment-based and doesn't account for high housing costs or other costs. Next slide. This is the data set, or what the data set looks like when we download it. It comes in a very easily manipulated CSV file. As Erin said, most of the data comes from the American Community Survey, and then with some validation with Energy Information Administration data, as well as state, city, local, and government reporting. Next slide. So after downloading this file, I tried to visualize some of the raw data, and I did that by housing status, just to see what the breakdown is for renter and owner occupied counts. Next slide. And I also did this by housing type. And this is just a sample of the housing types that the data set includes, which I've listed the full set on this slide. So we used these breakdowns to try and calculate some of the burdens and visualize the rest of the data. Next slide. So moving on into the calculations and data visualization. These are the actual columns of data that I calculated. So burden greater than 6 is the dollar amount in assistance needed to eliminate high energy burden in each of the counties. Total energy burden is the total dollar amount spent on energy. I also calculated burden greater than 6 just for the electricity fuel type, because this was the only type that included burdens that were greater than 6. So gas and other fuels did not have energy burden greater than 6. And then I also calculated per household burden. Next slide. So these are the calculations. So I use the annual energy cost, the average energy burden as a percent of income, the percentage of energy burden over 6%, and the housing counts to come up with a grand total estimation of the dollar amount needed to eliminate high energy burden in each of the counties for a year. And then I divided that by the housing counts to come up with a per household burden greater than 6% household income. Next slide. So this is how I visualize the results. The x-axis is county. The y-axis is total energy assistance need. And it can be a little bit confusing, but each of the chunks is the total amount for that AMI group. So for instance, in Spokane County, the 0 to 30% group, it has about 10 million need, whereas the 30 to 60% group has about 250,000 need. And just as a reminder, low income, according to CETA, is 80% and below AMI and 200% and below federal poverty level. So I also included the housing count graph just to show that the concentration of need is in 0 to 30% AMI, even though this group does not make up the majority of owner-occupied households. So also of note is that on this slide, King County has the highest in assistance need. And next slide. But by calculating the per household burden, King County actually has a very low household burden compared to some of the other slides. Again, 0 to 30% AMI group represents a large slice or 0 to 30% AMI represents a large need, but a small slice on the housing counts. Next slide. So calculating these results for renter-occupied households shows some of the limitations that we came up with using the 6% threshold. We actually found that King County and Chelan County have a 0% total assistance need using this 6% threshold. Next slide. And that's a little bit more visible using the per household burden. And next slide. So we decided to use a 4% threshold to calculate total assistance need. And we actually found that King County had a 22.7 million need in the 0 to 30% AMI, which comes out to about 287 per household assistance need. And Chelan County has a $157,000 need in the 0 to 30% AMI, which is about 113 per household. And I believe Brian Hoxford at Seattle City Light can speak a little bit on the Seattle Energy Equity Rate pilot.
Thanks, Juliet. This is Brian Hoxford from Seattle City Light. Thanks for giving me the opportunity to just take a quick mention here that we found this energy burden threshold very interesting when we were designing our energy equity rate pilot late last year. And we decided after much design work to set our energy burden eligibility threshold at 4% or higher, and targeting what we thought would be customers that would be eligible for a utility discount program otherwise. And also a bulk of those customers were going to be coming from the $25,000 to $50,000 annual income range. So this is very interesting to me, and you can also tell with the high cost of living, and the average rent in Seattle is north of $2,100 a month, up to $3,000. So cost of living, housing costs certainly play a threshold in the metropolitan cities, but especially Seattle and King County. So thank you, Juliet.
Yes, thank you for explaining. Next slide. So potentially another limitation in using county level data is that it kind of erases some of the more granular variations that we'd see at the census tract level. So I actually decided to download King and Chelan County census data, and I calculated this at the 6% burden and found that there was actually a total assistance need. And interestingly enough, that need is concentrated in the 30 to 60% AMI group. I didn't quite have time to delve into why that might be, but it does show potentially the need for using census tract data, and for there to be maybe an easy way to access which census tracts each utility is responsible for.
Yeah.
Next slide. So I also ran these same calculations on different building types, and you can see that a lot of the need is concentrated in the 0 to 30% AMI for one unit detached, just like in the different housing statuses. Again, King County has a very high total assistance need. Next slide. But then when you look at per household burden, that evens out so that maybe some other counties have a higher per household energy need. And for all of these counties, there is some level of energy assistance need in 1 unit detached. But if you go to the next slide, we'll see that that's not the case with some multifamily units. So not every county in multifamily units expresses energy assistance need. Next slide. And again, with the per household burden. Next slide.
We don't have any units that big.
So I wanted to include the boat, RV, van building type, just because this is a new addition to the data and it's exciting that I'm able to present on this. And if you remember, a lot of that need was concentrated in the 0 to 30%, 30 to 60% for the other building types. But for boat, RV, van, we see something a little bit different where some of this need is in the 80 to 100% AMI. Next slide. And we can see this with the per household burden where some of these boat, RV, van do experience a high per household energy assistance need. We don't know quite why this is. It might be that there is a much smaller sampling size compared to other building types. It also might be a little bit more difficult to track energy costs for these housing types, but it's an interesting trend to note. Next slide.
Juliet, can you clarify here? Is that the housing declared is a boat, RV, or van?
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
Is this the housing the person declares is a boat, an RV, or a van?
Yeah, I'm assuming when they fill out their survey, they select that they have a boat, RV, or van as their housing type. Does that answer the question?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Next slide. So some takeaways just from looking at this data is that a lot of the high energy burden is concentrated in that 0 to 30% AMI category. Using smaller iterations of geographic data, so census tract versus county data can show a more granular, some more granular information that might be lost at higher levels. The highest per energy assistance need is in different counties compared to the total highest energy assistance need. And this was true when we separated by housing status and housing type. And that finally, there are limitations with using a 6% energy burden as a threshold for energy assistance need. And with that, I will hand it off to Sarah for any questions and to open up for discussion.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Juliet. And just on a personal note, I want to say how lovely it has been to work with you this summer. It's just been really great to have you just be really creative with this data and hop in feet first with this. So thank you for all your work. And yeah, we had a couple questions in the box, so I think I might walk through some of those. And then some of the clarifying questions. And then I kind of want to get a read of the room and talk about what's next. So, you know, Steve, you had a question, Steve Taylor from Cowlitz, and Aaron, this might be a good one for you. It asks, does the energy burden and need figures consider only income earned, or does it account for public assistance transfer payments in their income? So what's the nature of the income data that we're seeing?
That is a great question, and I apologize. I don't know the answer off the top of my head. I'm happy to, I'll take some of these down too and try to get a little more information on that. Since it comes from the American Community Survey, it might just be what the person has listed, but I don't know for sure if that's included. But I can, yeah, I'll write some of these down and get a little more information and send them back, and you can distribute them as needed if I can.
Great. Yeah, and actually maybe, is there anyone on the tag that works with American Community Survey data and happens to know the background on the income data? I think it's what they report in terms of income earned, but I would not, don't take my word for that. I actually just signed up for a survey or a webinar to understand how to use income data from the ACS. So I hope to learn more about this myself, but not sure if anyone knows. Okay, well, we'll get that answer for you, Steve. It's a great question. Anna, you just mentioned that FPL gets adjusted, that FPL does not get adjusted for the area as AMI does, but it is based on number in the household, which is true. And so, yes, so there are two metrics that the Clean Energy Transformation Act considers when we're talking about low income households in Section 12. So you have the federal poverty level, which for a low income threshold, it's considered 200% and below. And for the area median income, it's 80% below. Obviously, there's sort of give and takes on which to use. And there's a lot of debate about those two. The state of Washington's poverty reduction work group chooses to use federal poverty level, and they set the threshold at 200%. So that's a pretty good metric, but in terms of like how the state agencies might be thinking about stuff. But I would say that for the utilities, we have a split on which we use, and there's reasons for that. So my hope is to continue to use both, depending on which makes the most sense for your programs. But good point that one is based on area median income, and then the other is based on household size. And if anyone wants to talk more about that offline, I'm happy to do so. And again, why Juliet chose to look at AMI. I think we were just wanting to, start somewhere and look at a data set and see what happens. So there wasn't a policy reason, but it was just one to be able to look at some of this location-specific data. So those are all the questions I saw in the box. Does anybody have questions about this data that we presented and what it means, or maybe questions about, for Erin, about where it comes from that we can look up? Kind of first blush. Well, if it comes to you, please go ahead and put it in the chat box. I'm also hoping to, this is just the first dip into this data, so we will continue these conversations. And then I do have a couple of questions. I just wanted to open this up for a little bit of a discussion today. I know we have several hours for this meeting, but I promise not to extend it just to extend it. So, if folks are not feeling chatty today, that's no problem. But we're going to be using this data. We're going to be aggregating this into, kind of some Excel documents and then some data visualizations, and make those available on our website especially for utilities that need to do their reports next year, but also for anyone really that wants to understand the nature of energy burden in the state. And so we're just trying to understand what is most useful, what comes across, what doesn't, where we need to kind of do some more clarification. So the first question I kind of had was around what data that was presented today did you find most compelling or interesting? Or maybe kind of at first glance, it really kind of sparked your interest and you might want to learn more. And just feel free to unmute and start talking.
Sarah, this is Amanda from Commerce in the Low Income Weatherization Program. I think the thing I found most compelling is how much it's going to cost to address the energy burden. And then also the change from, I can't describe it now. I wish I could go back in slides. But when you're looking at energy burden at a county level, how it changed from King County having a high dollar amount of need, but then when it's on a per unit basis, it changed.
Right.
Yeah, that was interesting.
Yeah, it's a really important one that Juliet brought up when she was presenting the data to me. So, I think it's important when you're doing program design, right, to think about what's the actual amount we're talking about per household. And, I think when you see it, I don't know, my reaction is when I see it in aggregate, it kind of punches you in the gut. But when I do see it on a household level basis per year, I'm like, oh, okay, well, this feels that feels approachable. So, you know, I think being able to understand the slices of where those households are at and who has the most need. I mean, everyone that is a practitioner on the phone, I'm not saying anything you guys don't already know. So I think being able to have that data across the state and maybe understand policy outcomes that could be extrapolated for the whole state, and try to think through, you know, how could we empower CAPS to work with utilities on maybe a specific target group. How we, you know, are there agencies or other community-based organizations that work with a particular group or housing type, you know, a particular use case that we can really tease out across the state. I just don't think we have that data right now. And I, you know, Amanda, maybe you would agree with me on that, that having kind of this apples to apples comparison is really useful.
Yes.
Kelly, I see you asked a question. How will we calculate the energy burden for a particular utility when multiple utilities share the territory in the LEAD tool? Great question. One we've been getting quite a bit. And so I think really what we're seeing is that the census tract level is the one where we're going to get the best, most sort of accurate data. Hopefully, I actually can't say if it's accurate, but there seems to be more data available when you aggregate census tracts together into your service territory. In terms of, you know, I think for certain territories, I'm thinking of like Columbia REA and PAC and things like that, and where you guys are as well at Big Bend. Like if it's, you know, across the street, you know, it's really hard to discern. You know, I think we're just going to have to do our best job with estimating those census tracts. So I don't know, Kelly, I don't know if you know, but like if you get down to the census tract level, is it still pretty hard to discern which utilities serve which census tracts? Do you know?
Can you hear me, Sarah?
I can, hi.
Hi. Yeah, it is. And that was one of my main concerns. Like, for instance, take the city of Pasco.
Mm-hmm.
We have a lot of the newer developments that are being built in Pasco, but obviously we don't have the entire city. We have, you know, you might be talking hundreds of households, but not the entire city. So I'm a little concerned how that, you know, if we have to count the whole city, that's going to make a huge impact on our numbers versus like Franklin PUD that might have the rest of the city, but their numbers too, you know, they don't have some of the newer developments that are going in. So I'm a little concerned about that.
Yeah, I know it's a really important point. You know, and so it speaks to a couple things. Like one, it speaks to the fact that there are limitations to using aggregated data like this. And so, you know, ideally in this beautiful future world that I envision for us all, we're going to be aggregating household level data and, you know, into maps like this for the state, though admittedly that seems to be a bit of the ways off. For utilities that have those kinds of issues, I am happy and willing and more than willing to sit down and try to work with you to figure out what's the best way to split those hairs, because at the end of the day, it can have a big impact, especially for a small utility. So Kelly, please let's be in touch about that. And that's kind of the best I can do. Although Christina, you asked a good question, and Erin, you might know the answer. She asked if you can subtract a city from a census tract when you're looking at the data.
That is a good question. And no, there's not a way to do that.
Okay, other than maybe writing down all the totals, other than like in Excel, like with the raw data.
Yeah, you could do that, download the information about the cities and then remove that from the census tract if you wanted to. Yeah, that would work. But yeah, not in the tool itself.
Okay. I do think I've been thinking about this a lot, especially with Juliet and I talking through this data. And I think what would be really useful is to have some sort of like agreed upon conversion of utility to census tract. And so, you know, that we all are using the same way, you know, these census tracts equal these utilities. And maybe there's like a weighted average we can use for shared census tracts. I know Glenn Blackman has looked at, because what we were trying to do was look at this for legislative districts, so which also have overlapping census tracts. So say, you know, what's the total energy burden for the 22nd district? You know, as a way to talk to some of our legislators about this work. And I think we could do something similar. And then so there's like a weighted average that needs to happen depending on how much of the census tract is in one of the areas. So that is definitely something we can pursue with utility service territory. And Anna, our data whiz from the buildings unit, also says that she might be able to use GIS to help us figure this out. So I also know the little tricky thing here in Washington, right, is we don't have utility service areas. So utilities are going to have to help me with that one, because I know it is a bit contested sometimes about what is where, and those maps can be difficult. So I want to, Austin or someone that's taking notes, if we can flag this particular topic, I think it's worth a deeper dive and figuring out how to have a resource that is the reference for this work. And so any utility can go to, say, like an Excel sheet that has sort of a, for lack of a better way of saying it, a way to translate their service territory into census tracts for the purposes of understanding how to use the LEAD tool. So yeah, let's put that on our list. And Brian Sorensen asks, is it possible to overlay LIHEAP assistance provided to the map? That's a good question. Aaron, do you know if there's ever any intention of DOE trying to bring in some LIHEAP data?
I don't know of that off the top of my head. One of the things that we are doing is going to be putting in tribal nation territories. So those also work into census tracts. So the nations themselves also fall into census tracts. So one of the options that we're pursuing is to have a user either choose to show the county borders when they're looking at a census tract map, or to show a tribal nation borders, and so they can see all the census tracts within that. If there is kind of a nice, I don't know off the top of my head with the LIHEAP data. Well, actually, so in terms of overlapping it, I don't think there'd be plans for that, but if there are, sorry, I was kind of combining the two ideas of like service areas and the LIHEAP data. So no, there's probably not. Sorry, I was just thinking that. But
you're fine, yeah.
There's not currently a plan to do that. Although we're certainly open to hearing what people need and other options we can do with the LEAD tool. So if you want to provide some more information about kind of an instance of how that would be used or what would be useful with it, we are certainly open to hearing about that and seeing what we can do.
Yeah, and Brian, I do think there's an opportunity with our internet services folks, our information services folks here in Commerce, to take our internal data, to be able to download all the data that LEAD has and combine it with your LIHEAP data, and then create an internal dashboard that would hopefully be an external dashboard. And I have been having those conversations with Anna, with also with Liz Saylor and her group in information services. So I think there is an opportunity. It's just a matter of kind of what makes the most sense. But as everyone on this call knows, we're going to need to, Commerce is going to be responsible for aggregating the LIHEAP data for everyone. So we should definitely figure it out.
I agree. I've been bugging them about piloting for the GIS. I want to give them data and have them map my data.
Yes, well, let's harass them together so that we can get that done. And I will,
that works for me.
Connect with you offline about that. Fantastic.
Okay.
And then just so everyone knows, we do have that data for weatherization. We've gone back 10 years
heck yes.
and mapped it with the Washington Tracking Network. And so we have the data to add into that when you're ready.
Data on data on data. I love it.
Right.
And Aaron, you know, that's the kind of stuff that we can definitely share with you if we're using LEAD tool data, so you can see the kind of use cases that we're putting together here in the state.
That sounds wonderful. Absolutely like to see that. Yeah.
Great. Brian, oh, you have to, you're saying yes to Brian. Thank you, Brian, and thanks for hopping on and talking about the program today. That was really helpful. Okay. Well, there's other questions in the box. I definitely do want to ask just one more question here today, or two. So I am curious, we had some stuff that's compelling and interesting. I am curious if there's anything that's just like really confusing, or, you know, just at first blush as we're walking through this, it's clear to you're going to want some more clarity on. Because I definitely want to make sure we're, in addition to the data, providing instructions that are useful. And I know the DOE lead tool has I think you have a tutorial video, if I'm not mistaken, Erin, you know, and those kinds of things.
We do have a tutorial video. Since we've recently updated the tool, that video will be getting updated as well. So it can show some of the general features of it. But you know, we're always happy to answer questions. Down at the bottom of the very bottom of the website, there's an option to share your questions, comments, and use cases, and it's just lead.tool@ee.doe.gov. So if there are any questions too, you can email that, and then myself or somebody else can get back to you, but I'll post that here if people have
perfect.
questions.
Thank you. Yeah, and I'd also offer, I'm happy, you know, if there's several utilities that are wanting to dive deeper into something, or, you know, I'm happy to be sort of a go-between to help kind of get these questions answered and then post them more formally, because I'm sure you guys are not the only ones that have them if you have them. So, you know, eventually we'll get going kind of a frequently asked questions for the state as well, and we'll have that kind of stuff available. So that would be great. But yeah, anything that pops up as confusing, or folks just want to hear a little bit more information about today or for future? Okay, I did hear maybe some more information about the income, right? So like where everything comes from. So I think it might be useful to provide some specifics on where the ACS data comes from, which is not the purview of DOE, like that's not their data set. So I will also make sure that we can provide links to what that data is and how it is collected and aggregated. Okay. And then I guess the other question is, and this one I don't necessarily need answers today, I just want you guys to be thinking about this. So, you know, Juliet did this amazing job of putting together these visualizations. You know, we really sat down and tried to think about what was going to be a compelling way to look at this data across the state. And for me, you know, the overrepresentation of the lowest income folks was really stunning, right? And I think it's probably no surprise to anyone here that's a practitioner that that's true, but I think seeing it so consistently across the state is really useful information. I think also the difference, some of the per household numbers was really useful, and helps get an idea of, you know, what are we talking about in terms of similarities and differences across counties. There's also an opportunity to drill down more, right? And the data ask in section 120 is having us look at, you know, specifically housing type, building year, you know, fuel type, these kinds of things. So, you know, I think the issue is there's the iterations there are endless, right? The amount of things we could show are endless. So just putting in your minds and thinking about what would be the most useful data visualizations for your utility. So is it, you know, household type, you know, per income level, disaggregated by income level, and energy burden? Is it household counts purely and the household types don't matter? So, you know, what kind of stuff is useful for you? And then also considering the data that we have available on the Washington Tracking Network. Austin, can you scroll down two slides? Okay, 3 slides. Yes. So, oh, there you go. And so we had hoped to get a little bit more of this done, but we're still playing around with it. You know, there's all this data on the Washington Tracking Network that overlays environmental health disparities, you know, across the state. And that's a cumulative impact analysis that looks at things like environmental impacts, socioeconomic factors, et cetera. And so this is just a county by county breakdown that Juliet put together of the environmental health disparities score for that county. And so the way it happens is it's kind of a relative score based on these cumulative indicators. And so what's interesting, and then I did a further look at this of breaking it down to see how that compares to energy assistance need. And at a first glance, saw that there was kind of opposite correlation between, so if you had high energy burden, high energy assistance need in your county, your environmental health disparities were a bit lower. And if you had high environmental health disparities, your energy assistance need was lower. So it's just kind of this inversely proportionate thing, but it was also very scattered data and I need to redo it. So like, let's not take any of that for, for the word right now, but there's an opportunity to take all this data we just looked at and also combine it with the environmental health disparities data from Washington Tracking Network and think about what the opportunities there are for kind of visualizing this data across the state. So mostly just teasing that in your brains to kind of think further about what's possible. But yeah, so I'm hoping, I think with that, I think we'll go ahead and wrap up here, but I will pause for one more second and see if there's anything else on people's minds, any other questions that anyone wants to get out before we kind of wrap for the day. Okay, well, I just want to say a big thank you to Erin. It's just so great to have NREL as a partner on this work and be able to use the good work that you all have been developing for several years now, from Celica now to the DOE lead tool. So thank you so much for your time today and looking
You're
forward
very
to
welcome.
doing some follow-up with you. Yeah. And also, Juliet, thank you again. Big thank you for all the help you've provided Commerce. I'm so sad that you'll be leaving us, but happy to tap into your brain for at least the next week. I think I have you. So thank you again for all your work and also doing this with some horrible computer troubles today. So just a really big extra thanks for that.
Yes. Thank you for all your guidance on this, Sarah.
It's been a team effort for sure. We're both learning a lot.
Yep.
And then finally, I just, Austin, I hope we're able to capture all the questions from the chat today, because I'll want to go back and make sure we got, we can get all that stuff answered. And then in terms of the next tag, I think we have kind of one a month through the end of the year. I'm not sure that we're going to need all of those. I don't want us just to have meetings, but this conversation and the work I've been doing with Juliet has really brought up some big ideas that I would like to talk with you all about. So the service territory question, I have some questions also about some of the behavioral aspects of energy burden and some other things that will be important going forward. So, you know, we might end up canceling the next one and then just circling back in November after we've had a chance as well to get all of your utilities survey data. So I will be in touch with you about that. But if anybody has something that they would love to see us be talking about or do a deeper dive on, just please let me know, because definitely here to try to figure out how to do this the best way we can with the data and time we have available to us. So, and actually, Vince Schuler as well has done some really great work looking at the LIHEAP data as well as the energy burden data from LEAD. So we might have him on to talk a bit about that stuff as well. So great. All right, everyone. Well, with that, enjoy your unscheduled hour. I'm sure it's like a vacuum and it'll get sucked up soon by something else. But if there's any questions or comments or concerns, don't hesitate to reach out and we'll talk to you all soon.